When I was 24, I moved to a new town for work. I got a cozy little apartment on the third floor of a quiet building, and everything seemed perfect. I didn't know many people yet, so I signed up for a couple of dating apps just to put myself out there. That's how I met Ethan. Our first date was at a cozy cafe. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We talked for hours, and by the end of the night, I felt like we had a real connection. He texted me the next day, saying he had a great time and wanted to see me again. I agreed, feeling really good about the whole thing. This time we went to a restaurant for dinner. I think it was an Italian place. Again, I enjoyed myself a lot. He was attentive, paid for dinner, and even walked me to my car afterward. As we said goodbye, he kissed me on the cheek. Now I don't know how to put it, but something felt strange. It wasn't necessarily inappropriate, but it lingered a little too long, like he was testing boundaries. But I put it off, thinking I was overanalyzing, and seamlessly agreed to a third date. We went to see a movie. During the film, he kept trying to hold my hand or put his arm around me, the typical cinema moves. I didn't mind at first, but it became excessive. Every time I shifted in my seat, he'd move closer, like he was trying to close any gap between us. By the end of the movie, I felt suffocated. When we left the theater, he asked if I wanted to go back to his place. I declined, saying I had an early morning, even though I didn't. He seemed disappointed but accepted the slap in the face and moved on. Even though I didn't have to wake up early the next day, I was awoken at 6:30 by a text from Ethan, asking me if I had fun. I thought it was weird, but then again, he must have assumed I had been up by then. I replied with a yes, but I also mentioned that I thought we were moving a little too fast. He responded with a long message about how he really liked me and didn't want to waste time playing games because he was already pushing 30, which I thought was already quite weird in itself. Reading this message made me feel uncomfortable, like I was being pushed into something. After much hesitation, I replied saying that I appreciated his honesty, but that I needed some space and want to take a step back to figure things out. Now looking back, I probably should have chosen a better wording for my thoughts. Ethan didn't reply to my message that day. But a day or two later, I started getting messages like, "How's your day going?" or "Thinking of you." It started off as kind things, but it got to a point where he was texting me almost hourly. And if I didn't respond instantly, he'd send follow-up messages asking if I was okay or if he'd done something wrong. I tried to be polite, but it was overwhelming. After 2 weeks of madness, I eventually told him that I didn't think we were a good match and that it would be best if we stopped seeing each other. But the texts didn't stop. His messages turned angry, accusing me of leading him on and wasting his time. He demanded to know why I didn't feel the same way about him, even though we'd only been on 3 dates. I blocked his number, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, when I left my apartment in the morning to go to work, I noticed a car parked outside my apartment building. It was there in the morning when I left for work, and still there when I came home at night. I have a good eye for details, so I knew that this car hadn't been there in the past. It was only when I scrolled through photos on my phone and saw a selfie of Ethan that he had sent me standing in front of his car, that it was in fact the same car. I didn't see Ethan in the car, but I could see that it was the same license plate. I didn't know what to do at this stage. Was he stalking me? I convinced myself that it must be a dumb coincidence. Maybe he had a friend in the area. Besides, I never actually told him where I lived. That night, just as I came out of the bathroom and hopped into bed, I heard a knock on my door. I got up and went to look through the peephole. It was Ethan, standing there, holding a bouquet of flowers. I didn't answer the door, but he knocked again, louder this time. Finally, he left the flowers on my doorstep and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before opening the door to grab the flowers. There was a note attached. "I'm sorry. I just want to talk. Please give me another chance." I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't know how he knew where I lived. As I said, I had never given him my address. I texted him one last time, telling him to leave me alone and never come to my apartment again. I also mentioned that I would call the police if he didn't stop. He didn't respond. I called up my best friend and asked her what to do. Eventually, I went to the police station and filed a report, explaining everything that had happened. They told me to document any further contact and to call them immediately if he showed up again. But there was not much they could do at this point. Feeling unsafe in my own building, now that he knew where I lived, I decided to install a security camera outside my apartment, just in case. After that, things went quiet for a while. I started to feel like maybe he'd finally gotten the message. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of someone trying to open my front door. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and hid in my closet. I could hear the doorknob rattling, and then silence. I stayed in the closet for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the door was still locked. But from the outside, there were scratches around the keyhole, like someone had tried to pick the lock. I called the police, and they came to check things out. They didn't find anyone, but suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, so I packed a bag and went to my friend's place. The next morning, I checked the footage from my security camera. Sure enough, it was Ethan. It was him, who had been outside my door, trying to get in. I took the footage to the police, and they were finally able to take more serious action. They paid him a visit and warned him to stay away from me. I also got a restraining order, which gave me some peace of mind. But even with the restraining order, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I started noticing small things, a similar car parked a few blocks away, or a figure standing across the street from my building at night. I never saw his face, but I could feel his presence. Eventually, I decided to move. I couldn't live like that anymore, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if he was going to show up again. I found a new apartment in a different part of the city, and didn't tell anyone except my closest friends and family where I was living. It's been a few years since then, and I haven't heard from Ethan. But I still think about him sometimes. I don't know if he's moved on, or if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to reappear. All I know is that I'll never feel completely safe again. It was the summer before my freshman year of high school. I had just turned 14, and like most kids my age, I was spending my days hanging out with friends, riding bikes, and trying to make the most of the last few weeks before school started again. I lived in a close-knitted neighborhood where most people knew each other. But there was one person I didn't know, a guy who lived a few streets over. To protect his identity, I'll call him Alex. I first noticed Alex during one of my evening bike rides. He was standing on the corner of my street after taking out the trash and just watching me. I thought it was weird, but didn't think too much of it. As the days went on, I started seeing him more and more. He was always creeping along the streets. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was overreacting. After all, it was a small neighborhood. It wasn't unusual to see the same people around. One afternoon, I was walking home from my friend's house when I noticed Alex following me. He was about 20 feet behind, matching my pace. I told myself it was just a coincidence. But when I turned the corner onto my street, he turned too. I picked up my pace, and so did he. By the time I reached my driveway, I was practically running. I slammed the front door shut behind me and locked it. I told my parents about Alex, but they didn't take me too seriously and told me it was probably nothing. I was on high alert every time I left the house after that occasion. But I didn't see him for a few days. I started to relax more and more. Maybe it had just been a weird coincidence after all. It was late at night and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when a notification popped up. It was from an unknown number. "I saw you today. You looked beautiful." I considered replying to ask who this is, but didn't send it. Maybe the person had the wrong number. When I woke up the next morning, I had another message on my phone. "Come on, Josh, talk to me." This person knew my name, so it was definitely not an accident. I couldn't prove it, but I knew it was Alex. But how did he get my number? I showed the messages to my parents, and they immediately called the police. The officer who came to our house took down the information, but there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. He suggested I change my number and block all contact with him. It wasn't exactly comforting advice. My parents were furious. I didn't want to get a new number, and instead blocked Alex's. What happened then is that he just resorted to messaging me on all my socials. I didn't understand how he found me that quickly. He probably had been watching me far longer than I thought. Often the messages were creepy compliments, but other times they were angry rants about how I was ignoring him. I stopped going outside unless I was with my parents or friends. I even stopped riding my bike, which had been one of my favorite things to do. One evening, I was in the kitchen helping my mom with dinner when we heard a loud thud against the side of the house. My dad went outside to investigate, but there was no one there. The next morning, we found a note taped to our front door. It was addressed to me. It read, "You can't hide from me." My parents called the police again. They stopped by and examined the note. They told us they would follow up on it, but we never heard anything from them again. A few nights later, I was sitting in my room. The window was slightly ajar, so I could hear the sound of the crickets outside. At some point, I heard a whistling sound, something human-like. At first, I thought I must be tripping, but then a few seconds later, I heard it again. I was expecting to see one of my friends, coming to see if I was down for a nighttime adventure that we used to do a lot in the past. However, it wasn't a friend standing there. It was Alex, standing in our backyard, looking up at me. He just stood there and stared while continuing with his whistling sounds. I screamed for my dad, who came running. But by the time he got to my room, Alex was gone. The next day, my dad decided to take matters into their own hands. He went over to knock on Alex's door, but nobody answered. When he asked some of the neighbors, most people had no idea who he was. One guy mentioned that he had recently moved in, but didn't know anything else about him. Some days passed before I finally spotted Alex on the street again. I kept walking, pretending that I hadn't seen him. I secretly pulled out my phone and texted my dad that Alex was following me. Luckily, my dad was at home and saw the message instantly, because not even 30 seconds later, I saw him running towards me. I pointed out Alex and my dad went over to him. At first, Alex tried to turn around and walk away, but my dad was a pretty big guy, and there was no escaping him. I didn't hear exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of telling him to stay away from me if he valued his life. My dad got quite loud, and I could tell that Alex felt uncomfortable. He didn't say much. I guess he was scared shitless. When my dad came back, he told me that I wouldn't have to worry about Alex again, that he won't bother me anymore. I asked him why, but he told me to simply trust him. I rarely saw Alex again after the altercation. Every few weeks I would see him out and about, but he never even glanced at me. Also, the messages stopped, and life seemed to return to normal. Eventually, after a few months, he moved out of the neighborhood. I really wonder what my dad said to him, but to this day, he hasn't told me. The biggest mystery remains as to how the hell Alex got my number, but I guess I'll never find out. I'm so glad that I told my parents about him, and that my dad took action. If you ever encounter a situation like this, get help from the people around you before it's too late. I want to stay as anonymous as possible while sharing this. To this day, I don't know if I was overreacting or if I narrowly escaped something much worse, but it's haunted me ever since. I used to live in a small apartment complex just outside the city. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, affordable, and close enough to my job. I kept to myself, worked long hours, and didn't have much of a social life. I was fine with that, until I met her. Her name was Rachel, or at least, that's what she told me. We met at a bookstore. I was browsing the horror section, and she made a comment about the book in my hand. Something about how she didn't like the ending. Rachel was beautiful, dark hair, green eyes, a little shy but funny in this awkward, endearing way. She gave me her number before I even had the nerve to ask, and I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. She was sweet, always excited to see me, and asked a lot of questions about my life. Where I worked, what my schedule was like, and if I lived alone. She worked part-time as a receptionist. Apparently her family was very wealthy. One night, I got home late from work and found Rachel sitting outside my apartment door. I thought it was strange. We hadn't made plans. When I asked her why she was waiting, she just laughed and said she felt like I needed company. This was only the first instance. I'd start seeing her at the coffee shop near my job, even though she worked in a completely different part of the city. She'd be at the grocery store when I was there, claiming it was just a coincidence. Once, I even saw her standing across the street from my gym. When I confronted her about it, she played it off like a joke. "Maybe I just miss you," she'd say with a grin. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was Rachel. "Hey, are you awake?" I didn't answer. I was too tired, and honestly, I was starting to get fed up with her constant need for attention. But then the texts kept coming. "Why aren't you answering? Are you mad at me? Please talk to me." I decided to ignore it. She must be drunk. But then my phone buzzed again. "I see your lights on. I know you're awake." I sat up as soon as I read it. I hadn't turned on any lights. I don't know why, but for some reason I decided to reach for the curtain and peek outside. And there she was. Rachel was standing on the sidewalk in front of my building, looking up at my window. Because I hadn't turned on any lights, I don't think she actually saw me. I decided not to answer her texts. Instead, I turned off my phone and sat there in the dark. After about 10 to 15 minutes, she turned around and walked off. The next morning, I told her we needed to talk. We met at a coffee shop, a public place, and I told her as gently as I could that her behavior was freaking me out. I didn't want to see her anymore. Rachel didn't argue. She just stared at me for an uncomfortable amount of time before saying, "Okay." Then she got up and left. A few days later, I started noticing little things in my apartment that were out of place. My bathroom cabinet was slightly open when I knew I had closed it. My shoes were lined up differently near the door. I even found my spare key, which was normally hidden in a drawer, sitting out on my kitchen counter. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I woke up in the middle of the night and heard a noise. Wide awake, I slowly turned my head towards the bedroom door. It was open. I never sleep with my door open. Never ever. I reached for my phone. That's when I saw Rachel's silhouette next to my bed. I couldn't even scream. I just lay there, paralyzed, as she whispered, "Why did you make me do this?" That snapped me out of it. I lunged out of bed, shoving past her and running for the front door. I didn't stop to grab my keys, my wallet, nothing. I just ran. I called the police from a gas station down the street. When they arrived at my apartment, Rachel was gone. But the door wasn't broken, meaning she had a key. I still don't know how she got in, but I was certain she had entered my apartment on numerous occasions before that night. The next day, I changed the locks. I also blocked Rachel's number and deleted every trace of her from my phone and my life, and just tried to forget her. I hadn't seen Rachel for weeks by this point, and thought I might have finally gotten rid of her. But then, one morning, I found a note in my mailbox. A single piece of paper with 4 words written in red ink. "Do you miss me?" I immediately turned around and scanned the streets and all the cars that were parked there, just waiting to spot her somewhere. But I didn't. The next week, I canceled my lease and moved to a different city. Luckily, my job was 100% remote by then, so it didn't matter where I was located. It's been over a year by now, and I still haven't seen her again. But I hope she has gotten the help she needs before she actually hurts someone.